As Mattias said, doing forecasts is difficult. Sometimes you're wrong, and sometimes you're right. I think what I'm going to tell you today, I think is not a happy story. When I look at the outlook, I see a development that will hit all of us. And we will be impacted. And if we are right, this will be a short downturn in the economic cycle. If we are wrong, I think the risks are on the downside. I think it's good to reflect upon, as Mattias started out with, to think about where are we. So what has happened to the global economy? What kind of shocks have we had that we actually are feeling today? Everything that has happened over the last 3 years is impacting business, it's impacting households, and it's impacting governments and central banks today. And of course, all of us remember the pandemic. And the pandemic is not over in a global context. And Glenn will later on talk about China and the impact pandemic still has on that. For all of us here, we couldn't meet in forums like this. We worked from home. Our demand changed. We couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't go abroad. So we consumed other goods instead. So it was a period of high demand for specific goods. Supply chain just disappeared. And there were a lot of bottlenecks from China to Europe to US. And we could see prices go up. The cost from transportation from Asia to Europe or to the US increased rapidly. Countries initially also couldn't really coordinate the actions. It took some time. And when we thought that we were out of this supply shock, and for economists, supply shocks usually means one thing, and that is prices up. Then when we saw the light this spring, early this year, we were hit by another shock that are impacting us as well as the pandemic. And that was when Putin invades Ukraine on the 24th of February. Also a supply shock, which means prices up. And there are a lot of other impacts out of the war in Ukraine. Who could think about a war in Europe just before New Year last year? It was unthinkable. We couldn't prepare. It was unforecastable. We couldn't do forecasts where we have a war. Nobody could. So where we are today is very much impacted by the shock of the pandemic, high demand, supply chain interruptions, and the war in Ukraine. So when we do our forecast then and look forward, all of this is impacting the global economy, Sweden, Lithuania, corporates and households. And we will feel what we will be going through. Because it will be worse before it gets better. So when we look out in the global economy, we will see a situation where inflation weighs on global activity. We think that the world, the global economy, will avoid a deeper recession, and we will only get stagnation. That is, next year will be a lost year for corporates, and even worse for households, I would say. We have inflations, and Mattias mentioned the Lithuanian one of 22%, and yesterday we got inflation in Sweden. It was 9%. We had inflation in the US recently, too high, and the market reacted with equity down, spreads up. We are in an environment where inflation is at a level we haven't seen for decades. Colleagues have not seen inflation many first-time buyers have never lived through inflation. And the implications of higher prices, the implications of higher interest rates. And all of this, central banks are behind the curve. Central banks should have taken away the punch bowl much earlier than they are doing. The problem with that is that inflation risks being more entrenched. Now, there are big differences between the US and Europe, and I will come to that. But who could think about inflation like Lithuania, 22%? Unthinkable. We also had a view 3 weeks ago when we published our forecast that we thought that the energy crisis in Europe were going to be worse than we had seen so far. I think we are already there. Because 2 weeks after, the gas from Russia to Europe was cut off. And this will be a cost of living shock for households. For some time to go, it will probably still be possible to roll over costs from corporates to households. But all of us, all households in Lithuania, in Sweden, in Germany, we're going to keep our wallet close to us. We're going to cut down on spending. And we need to do that, because inflation is at record high levels. For firms, this will have implications for investments. There are sectors that are impacted more than others, but overall, investments will be lower as well. Because the cost of funding has risen dramatically over the course of the year. And in all of this, in my view, the downside risk is much bigger than the upside risk. And one of the drivers behind this, in my view of looking at the global economy, the European economy, Lithuania and Sweden, is that inflation is something where the central bank is behind the curve, as I said. And you can look at the chart, how many decades it was since we actually had high inflation. We are in a different environment, and there are shocks that have driven inflation to levels where we are, but it's much broader inflation, in particular in the US, but also so in Europe. And the risk is that central banks tighten too much. It's already obvious that the global economy, the European economy, and the Swedish economy is slowing down. I could see this morning that the French government, for example, lowered their growth forecast for next year. Still, I think they're a bit high. They had a forecast for 1%. We will see stagnation in Europe. Also in the US, later during the winter or early next year, which means more or less no growth in general. So it will be a tough period. And the risk here is that central banks increase policy rates uncoordinated too much. So they actually put us in a deeper recession, and a recession that will be here for longer. And I don't envy the central banks, because it's a very, very difficult trade-off to do. When to stop? How has the transmission of monetary policy changed during the pandemic and now during the war period in Europe? And how much should you actually increase policy rates? So it always seems like a competition between central banks to increase as much as possible. And that has been our view since the spring, that central banks were going to front-load a lot of hikes this year and more or less stay on hold next year. But they might go too far. And then we will be in a weaker economic development for a longer period of time. Let's turn to Europe then. So in Europe, we all know about energy. Everybody here, myself in Sweden, we meet extremely high energy prices. The Russian gas was cut off, and Europe prepared according to the plan that the EU Commission launched in March this year to try to store as much gas as possible, and we have managed that quite well, but probably not enough. And if you look at the left or your right, energy prices in the future are even higher. And Germany is not the worst. It's actually French energy prices, because nuclear plants are not operating either. That's true for French nuclear reactors, and it's true for Swedish one. The Swedish one was actually earlier this week postponed a couple of months more. Energy prices up. So we do have an energy problem. The solution I have been waiting for, and the only solution I see, is EU Commission, which for me actually is an odd thing to hope for, that the EU Commission delivers something dramatical. I think they're on the way of actually doing that, because we need to shelter corporates and households, because the winter will be cold. Whether or not we actually have the energy we need in Europe or not. And it's not only about this year. There will be a winter next year as well, and here we have stored a large amount of Russian gas. Next year we need other gas from somewhere else, which means that somebody else on the globe will have to pay higher energy prices, or maybe not even get the gas that they need. I'm thinking about Asia in particular. So there are global impact of the war in Europe. So cost of living is going up. It will be high, and I'm not even sure that we will see a lot of relief next year. So what can the EU Commission do? I think a revenue cap for energy sources, every energy source except gas, is the right way to go, because it doesn't distort prices. If that revenue cap, the revenue that the EU brings back to households and corporates, then I think that can shelter some of the impact that we will feel during the winter. But then the question is, how fast can they do that? And how helpful will that impact be? I think that's a key for the winter and the early spring next year. So let's go to ECB then. So what can the ECB do? So 9% in inflation, target 2%. They are behind the curve, as the Riksbank, as the Fed, as many other central banks. They have hiked. The problem I see for ECB, it's not an easy task to decide when to stop hiking, when you know that the European economy will stagnate. So our GDP forecast for Germany next year is minus 0.5. France and Italy, more or less stagnation. It means a lot for Lithuania, for Sweden. All our export goes via Germany from Sweden, for example. So that will immediately hit the Swedish economy as well. So what should the ECB do? They have hiked 75 basis points. They will probably continue at least one or maybe two more meetings. But if they go on too far, I think we risk having a development in Europe which is not what we would have hoped for. I think we will see worsened economic conditions in Europe. We can already see the slowdown in Europe. The thing in Europe is that a lot of inflation is energy prices. We are reliant on Russian gas, nuclear plants that doesn't operate, and we need to invest much more in a green transition. If we move across the pond and look at the US economy, the problem is a bit different. In US, inflation is also very high, as you can see on the previous slide. The problem for Fed is different. It's not energy prices that are driving US inflation. It's more broad-based, and it's more driven by fiscal policy during the pandemic. So they sent out checks to everybody. For people that didn't have a lot of income, they spent that immediately. They actually had higher income during pandemic than before the pandemic. So it's more of a fiscal policy-driven inflation in the US, which to me means that the labor market, which is very tight in the US, the Fed more or less needs to kill it to get inflation down. To me, that's a risk that we will not see a soft landing. We might even see a hard landing, which means a deeper economic downturn and probably also a longer one. But they are put in a corner, and they need to take down inflation. And they've been very hawkish in their speeches, and I think they will continue that. You saw the reaction when inflation came out in the US, equity market down 3%, 4%, because markets were waiting and hoping for a pivot next year. I don't think we will see a pivot from Fed next year. Our forecast is that the Fed will be on hold. And also the housing markets in the US. In Sweden, house prices are falling. We have short mortgage rate contracts, so we are impacted immediately in Sweden by higher policy rates. In the US, that's not the case. They have 30-year fixed mortgages, which means that there will be a lag. But supply of unsold houses in the US is growing. I think it's a matter of time before we see house prices coming down in the US as well. So for the Fed, it's one way. As for the ECB, in the short term, that is higher policy rates. Now, I haven't been able to update this, whether or not the market still believes there's a pivot and lower policy rate during next year. I think there is a lot central banks have to do, but to decide when to stop is extremely difficult. I hope that they get it right, but it has never been this difficult for central banks over the last 20, maybe 30 years. We had a great moderation, before the global financial crisis. I was a central banker at that time, and when I went to Basel, I think it was more like we have seen the Holy Grail, and we know how to control a business cycle. Then came the global financial crisis, and we realized that we don't really understand everything about inflation. Then come the pandemic, then come the war in Ukraine, and it feels like central banks have lost their confidence, and in my view, also the compass, where to go forward. But we will see a lot of more hikes coming. And global economy next year, in our forecast, we will see global growth of 2%. In April, we had 3.5%. But there is something positive, at least for Western economies. I'm not going to rule Glenn's presentation about China, but China is slowing down, and that's helpful for us in the West, because the inflationary pressure from commodities will be less than if China grow above 5.5%, 6%. So that's at least is a positive note. But I think that's the only positive note I have, that China is a hedge for all of us. I think it's going to be worse before it gets better. I hope I'm wrong. We are wrong in our forecast. Unfortunately, I don't think so. When I meet corporates in Sweden, some of them are already feeling it. When I meet households, we are feeling high inflation, negative developments of real disposable incomes. All of us will feel it. We need to change our consumption and adjust it. We can already see it in the numbers. So, unfortunately, I think this forecast, at least to some extent, will come through. I think I'll stop there now, yes.
Thank you, Mattias. There are so many questions. I have to ask you to stay here for a while. And 2% global growth, that's not terrible, is it?
No. 4 is better.
4 is better, but I mean, 2 is still growth. It's not a global financial crisis. It's not a contraction, something that what we have seen at the beginning of this century.
No, but I think the reference to the global financial crisis is interesting. So I worked at the central bank, the Swedish central bank, during the global financial crisis, and I was more involved in actually trying to solve the crisis. But this crisis will hit in a different way. I don't think we are in a crisis near us, but we are in a cost shock. Everybody is going to feel the cost shock because our purchasing capacity, what we actually can buy, is decreasing because of the high inflation. So all will feel it. When we talk about the global financial crisis, sure, GDP drop, export dropped very quickly, but then we were out of it because central bank could respond with lower policy rate, liquidity, and then some fiscal policy. We can't do this now because inflation is running too hot. We can't lower policy rates, we can't use expansionary fiscal policy.
But we're going to see expansionary fiscal policy this time around.
Yes, in some countries, but all countries in Europe can't afford it. We in the north, we have our fiscal house in order. Unfortunately, that's a problem for the ECB. And that's why they have this cool name. That's my favorite name. So I'm happy I had opportunities to say that. The anti-fragmentation tool of the ECB to control spreads. Because all countries in Europe doesn't have fiscal in order. And I'm thinking about Italy, Greece, maybe even France. They can't expand fiscal policy too much. Germany, sure.
We have quite a few questions. Some of these questions will be addressed during the following presentations, especially on energy. One question is related to perhaps finding a silver lining. Perhaps it's not bad that we see higher inflation, higher interest rates, we exit the negative interest rate environment. Will there be other positive consequences when perhaps deposit interest rates will go up?
Yeah, I think there are many things, because if young people today have never seen inflation, have never lived through inflation, and only think about policy rates at 0 or even negative, I think this is good for everybody involved in risk, because risk needs to be priced. I think during the negative policy rates or the 0 policy rate, risks were not priced correctly because there were too much liquidity. Then I'm not overly pessimistic. I think there are winners in this. All sectors will not be hit in the same way. So forestry, for example, agriculture, I think defense and other suppliers to defense will have a good time going forward because everybody is going to spend on defense. Agriculture and forestry, it's a good hedge against inflation. So, and there are many other good examples of sectors that actually can benefit, at least in a comparison to other sectors going forward.
I agree that negative interest rates were aberration that had to go. I shared this story with you that I had quite a few emails and messages in Messenger from clients asking us, why did you raise Euribor as a bank? We are good clients, we were never late to pay. It's what you are saying, a new generation, they've never seen positive interest rates. So this has to change. And this may be a bit of a shock for some of the clients, especially those who have not estimated and expected higher Euribor rates.